Hello there, welcome to Creatures of London, episode 3, East End edition. So this is our third episode exploring the part animals have played in London's past and present. We've done the City of London, City of Westminster, and now we're on the East End of London. My name's Rebecca. I've been a tour guide in London since 2006 and a virtual tour guide since 2020. And the gentleman on my left
is Gordon. My name is Gordon. I've been a tour guide as well, going back, what feels like centuries.
And we're going to talk about the animals in the East End's history. So there's the East End, thanks to Google Maps. I'm using the kind of traditional boundaries of the East End for this. So that's Victoria Park up in the north, the River Lee out to the east, the River Thames down to the south, and the City of London to the west. That's kind of the traditional version of the East End. These days, a lot of people count Hackney as the East End as well, and who am I to argue? But this is the traditional East End. And actually, I grew up in a couple of parts of this East End, so I'll try not to be too nostalgic. So animals have played a big part in the East End historically. Certainly historically, it was a farming community until relatively recently, when the City of London and the City of Westminster were already built up. The East End was very much farming. So this is a map from the 1600s. So there's the Tower of London and there's the East End. So this is all fields. It's agriculture. It's cows and sheep and horses and goats. Even the early 1800s. So this is a map of London, the early 1800s. You can see City of London, City of Westminster, very built up. There's the Tower of London and there's the East End again. So again, we've got some activity around the docks, but much of the East End is still fields and agriculture. And that's largely because the City of London and the City of Westminster, before the days of trains, planes and automobiles, the City of London and Westminster needed somewhere for their dairy cows. They needed somewhere to keep their horses, the horses that were running drawing hansom cabs through the streets. They needed somewhere for industry that couldn't travel, like milk and beer breweries. And East London the East End served that purpose, as did South London as well. And by the early 1800s, we've got a few docks springing up in the East End as well. So there's this legacy of farm animals in the East End until relatively recently, historically recently anyway. But even after the East End was built up, we've got animals still coming through the East End on their way to Smithfield Market here in the City of London. If you weren't lucky enough to have the right to take your animals over London Bridge, you'd come maybe through the East End to get to Smithfield, or to Spitalfields Market here pictured here in the 19th century, which did deal in some live meat market. And perhaps because of that legacy, that sort of historic memory of the East End being farming, and perhaps because it was quite a poor area for quite a long time and into the early 20th century, it was a lot of people kept animals in their backyard. So you'd keep chickens or goats, sort of food animals for eggs and milk. And people had pets as well. Songbirds were particularly popular in the East End in the 19th century. And of course, there were performing animals as well. Music hall was big in the East End in the 19th century, across London, but very much in the East End as well. And here we've got performing birds. Footballing dogs were apparently all the rage in the East End in the 19th century. And working horses. There were hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of working horses in the East End, in a very small space, very densely populated the East End with humans and horses. And the docks, of course, were in the East End. Most of the docks were in the East End anyway. And this is St. Catherine's Dock, which would have had ponies and donkeys for haulage. But when it opened, it employed 300 cats as ratters to keep down the rats in the warehouses, and human rat catchers as well, but the cats were probably cheaper. And the stables here. There were a lot of stables in the East End for the hansom cabs that were going through the City of London and the City of Westminster. Many of the stables were in the East End. One of my ancestors, in fact, worked in a stables very much like this. So animals, an everyday part of the East End until the sort of mid-20th century, I would say, and such an everyday part that they're barely mentioned, except when something dreadful happens. There's several stories from the East End about runaway creatures from the live markets, runaway horses, which of course was a everyday peril in the rest of London, But again, in the East End, because of the population density of both working horses and humans, it was a peril to it. But yeah, if you go through East End census, you can see that a lot of jobs have something to do with animals. So back to the East End, having just said, oh yeah, there's been no animals since the 20th century in a terribly academic voice, Gordon's about to prove me wrong.
Well, in the heart of the built-up modern East End, to this day, there is Spitalfields Farm. Spitalfields Farm is around 1.3 acres. It was established in 1978 on wasteland as allotments. Backyard animals, historically, have been a staple of East End life, so the allotments were soon also home to chickens, rabbits and geese. By 1980, it was registered as a charity, and more animals, including sheep, pigs and goats, were introduced. And on this note, we have the goat race, which takes place at Spitalfields Farm each year on the same day as the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. Ha ha, see what they did there? The goats are assigned the university and a crowd gathers to cheer on their team, which is good. The farm assures us that the goats chosen to race are the ones most used to people and comfortable with noise and crowds. The goats are encouraged with food, but don't have to run if they don't want to. And the route they run is the same route they follow every day between their outdoor area and their indoor stables. The farm is open to the public, actually, so you can go and visit the animals who still live in the East End. Nearby, there is a sculpture of a goat, which is nothing to do with the goat race. It's just next to Spitalfields Market, which is now general shopping, but its first license in the 17th century was for flesh, fowl and roots. And until the 1990s, it was a fruit and veg market. The goat sculpture is just outside the market. It's 3.5 meters tall, including its tower of packing crates. And the artist Kenny Hunter said he chose the goat because goats are independent-minded and non-conformist, and he felt that that has always been the spirit of the East End. So there we go. There's also currently a herd of elephants roaming around Spitalfields Market, which were installed earlier this year. Not real elephants, I might add, statues. We don't have a photo of the statues, but here's the baby elephants they're based on. The statues are by Gillian Mark, and they're modelled on an orphaned elephants at the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust. You might remember the statues used to be at Marble Arch.
Yes, I do remember the Marble Arch. They are lovely statues in Spitalfields Market. If you're ever going to Spitalfields City Farm, want to pop around and see the statue of the goat. I just want to go through a couple of other statues in the East End. A few other statues. So up in Bethnal Green on Roman Road, just off Roman Road really, is the statue of the blind beggar and his dog. So the blind beggar and his dog it's an old East End legend about the blind beggar. There's a pub named the Blind Beggar, which you may have heard of in relation to the Cray legend, I think, the Cray story. But the blind beggar is an East End legend. So the legend goes that a chap called Henry de Montfort, who was the son of Simon de Montfort, the father of Parliaments. Henry de Montfort was injured in a battle in the 13th century in one of the Barons' Wars that were raging at the time, and he was blinded. Because of that, he lost his income and had to earn a crust. He had to beg on the streets of the East End with his faithful dog. Why his father didn't support him, I'm not clear on. The legend isn't specific. But the legend says that he fell in love with the woman who was nursing him, his carer, basically. He fell in love with his carer, and they had a daughter who was a beautiful girl and would go with her father when he went begging in the East End. And of course, all the men would flock around her, and the dog would always growl. If a man came up to the girl, to the daughter, the dog would growl at the man. And it would always turn out that the man had no interest in marrying her because he thought they were a poor family. He just wanted to, you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more. And this family weren't having any of that. And then one day a man approached the beautiful girl, and the dog didn't bark, didn't growl at the man. And this man fell in love with the girl. It's a whole fairy tale story. He fell in love with her, asked her to marry him despite the family's poverty. And Grandad Simon de Montfort heard about it and lavished them with money because of this story. So the blind beggar is an East End legend. The statue is by Elizabeth Frink, who actually has a lot of other kind of animal-related statues around London, in different parts of London. So this is Sheep and Shepherd by St Paul's Cathedral and Horse and Rider on Bond Street. A lovely sculptor, actually, Elizabeth Frink. Another statue right down by the Tower of London by St Catherine's Dock, which we saw an old picture of earlier, is Girl and Dolphin. Lovely, kind of gravity-defying statue. It's a fabulous thing. There it is from a different angle. Girl and Dolphin is by a sculptor called David Wynne, who's actually who studied zoology at Cambridge University before he became a sculptor. So he spent hours swimming with dolphins, days swimming with dolphins to get this dolphin right for this statue. David Wynne also has other animal-related statues around London. Boy and Dolphin, very similar, in Chelsea, kind of the other end of London, West London. Guy the Gorilla in Crystal Palace Park, and the Unicorn and Lion on the Queen Mother Gates at Hyde Park, all by David Wynne. And last statue is this fabulous one. This is quite new. This is Goodman's Fields in the Aldgate area, a very new development. And the artist Hamish Mackie had these statues of horses here because the name Goodman's Field, it comes from the fact that the land used to be owned by a Roland Goodman, who owned, back when all this was farms, I remember when all this was fields. Well, no, I mean, this is 16th century I'm talking here. He owned horses and he had fields, a farm here where he grazed his horses on the site. Hamish Mackie had this idea slightly later on. He was thinking more 19th century when there would have been horses stabled here, who would have been going out to work on the streets of the city of London as cab horses, handsome cab horses. And he had this feeling, the horses he's imagining in these statues is that these are working horses who find their stable door open and they just run out into freedom. They run out into the fields and run and play instead of being harnessed to cabs. So it's horses kind of finding their freedom, which is lovely. Right, sorry. Yes, working horses. You've got to think about working horses, haven't you?
Well, the East End particularly has been a general overview. The East End has been home to several industries, with brewing being an important one, a major one. The East End vied with South London to be London's brewing centre. And we have an image of the Truman Brewery, which was founded on Brick Lane in 1666. An ominous year for lots of reasons, but we won't go into all that palaver because there's a lot of it, poor old London. Anyway, this brewery opened 1666, Brick Lane, closed in the late 1980s, and now it's an events centre. Several other breweries and distilleries joined Truman's in the East End throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and it's argued that IPA was invented in an East End brewery. So there we go, possibly. Breweries had plenty of animal employees. In the Google Street View image here, on the right is Truman's stables, actually, capable of housing 114 horses. And when it was built in the 1830s, it was considered state-of-the-art. The horses delivered barrels and they turned wheels, which provided power. In London, mostly Shire horses were used. A Shire horse is roughly 170 centimetres tall, or whatever that is in hands, because that's how they measured them in the old days. It weighs about a tonne, A team of 2 Shire horses can pull up to 40 tons in weight. As well as being strong, they are intelligent, calm, and very even tempered, so they were considered ideal for heavy work in the noisy, crowded East End of London. The horses were worked hard, and animal rights charities today would be horrified at their conditions, but the breweries did seem to try and look after their equine employees. Charrington's brewery had a stables in Bethnal Green big enough for 100 horses, and they had their own blacksmith's forge. Mann, Crossman and Paulen Brewery built a stables on Cambridge Heath Road with a nosebag room for 150 horses to be fed at the same time. The nosebags were filled via a metal tube above them. There would have been hundreds of these horses working in breweries throughout the East End before industrialisation and trains and motor vehicles meant they were no longer needed. The last working dray horses left the East End in the 1940s. Until the early 19th century, some of the breweries would also have kept dairy cows and pigs. They would feed the grain byproducts to the dairy cows and pigs that were fed away from cow's milk. This engraving we see is from the 1750s. The big building is the Royal London Hospital on Whitechapel Road, and you can just about make out the buildings and the smoke of the East End industry behind it. As the East End became more built up throughout the 19th century, there was no longer room for these small holdings, although the East End is now home to a few city farms, so the legacy of farm animals continues.
Yes. Right, so back to our map of the East End. I'm afraid you can't kind of get through any tour of any topic in the East End without straying into Jack the Ripper. He really, the terrible killer really does overshadow East End's history. Lives quite large in East End history. I was going to avoid it, but there are a couple of animals involved. I don't want to talk too much about the dreadful murders and those poor women and their terrible man who committed the murders, but there were a couple of animals involved in the investigation. So in October 1888, there had been, that's the kind of area where the murders took place. In October 1888, there had been 4 murders and the police were under incredible pressure to catch this killer. The East End people were terrified of what was going on, particularly women, of course. A chap called Edwin Brough, there he is, had been trying for some time, even pre-1888, he'd been trying to convince the police that bloodhounds could track smells, that dogs' noses were so set, which we know now is the truth, dogs' noses were so sensitive that he would be able to track a particular person. Everyone else thought this was a slightly batty idea. Don't be ridiculous, it's just a dog. So Edwin Brough said, well, test me then. And Sir Charles Warren, who's kind of clutching at straws, and this would have been considered like a desperate straw. Charles Warren, who was the Commissioner of Police at the time, says, okay, let's test them. So Edwin Brough, brilliant. I'll send you my 2 best dogs, Barnaby and Burgo. The dogs were tested on Hyde Park, and all the press came to watch the dogs test that the police had set up. And all of the newspapers said, oh, the stupid dogs got lost in the fog. They never got to the end of the test. Complete lie. The dogs never even started the test. There was a traffic jam and they never got into London. They never even arrived at Hyde Park. Can you imagine newspapers making things up? There was another test and the police were sufficiently impressed that Charles Warren said, okay, yeah, we're going to use bloodhounds if the killer strikes again. This message must not have got through to Edwin Brough, though, because he, a couple of weeks after the test, he thinks, oh, well, they must not be interested then. And he sends the dogs off to dog shows. The 2 of them, they were champion dogs, so he sends them off to attend dog shows outside London. On the 9th of November, 1888, the final murder took place on Dorset Street. This is a 19th century picture of Dorset Street, which in the 19th century was considered the worst street in London. It was extreme. Parts of the East End were plagued with extreme poverty, and this was the worst. Just off Dorset Street, a poor young woman named Mary Jane Kelly was horribly murdered. So the police who turned up to investigate Mary Jane Kelly's murder knew that they were going to use bloodhounds. The plan was to use bloodhounds. So they stood outside Mary Jane Kelly's room. They didn't go inside because the hounds would need to get the scent of the killer rather than them. So they stood outside the room for hours before the message finally got through. Oh no, the dogs are out of London. They're not here. Carry on with your investigation. So the detectives carried on with the investigation. Didn't do the kind of credibility of bloodhounds any good at all. Although Edwin Bruff said that he believed the killer had struck when he did, because the killer believed that the dogs would have been able to track him. So he waited until the dogs were sent out of London and then he struck. Poor Edwin Bruff, it didn't really work. Nobody ever really believed that the bloodhounds were going to work. And it was another 50 years before the police started using dogs, but they did eventually. There was another creature mentioned in the investigation into the Jack the Ripper murders. The woman who lived above Mary Jane Kelly, so this window here, was named Elizabeth Prater. Early 20s, Elizabeth Prater was sleeping in her bed. At 4 o'clock in the morning, her kitten Diddles woke her up. That's not Diddles, that's just a cute cat. Oddly enough, I don't have a picture of Diddles. Diddles walked onto Elizabeth Prater's neck and did the head bump thing that cats do. And it woke her up. She kind of pushed the kitten away. All right, yeah, lie down. And as she was kind of half awake, half asleep, she heard a cry of, oh, murder, from the room below her. She said it was so faint that she thought it was someone waking up from a nightmare. And it all went quiet, so she went back to sleep. And of course, when she learned what had happened, it felt dreadful that she'd ignored poor Mary Kelly. But let's not dwell on the Jack the Ripper murders. There are plenty of excellent Jack the Ripper tours if you are interested in that, both virtually and in real life. There are several excellent tour guides doing that if you'd like to learn more about that. We're going back to the East End on a slightly lighter note. I'd like to go up to Shoreditch for Lady Dinah's Cat Emporium. So this is a cat cafe inspired by the craze in Japan. There's a craze for cat cafes in Japan. Which is it's a cafe with cats roaming around and you can stroke the kitties and they sit on your knee if they want to. In 2014, a woman started the Cat Emporium because she had realised that many Londoners don't keep pets because they're renting and they can't. Their landlords won't allow it. So she didn't want Londoners to miss out on that very therapeutic benefit of having a cat purring sitting on your lap. So she opened, here it is, Lady Dinah's Cat Emporium. This is really old Street View image actually, but I wanted to pick this one out. They've redeveloped it. Look, it's sort of dark green and very Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland, because it's named after Alice's cat in the book, Dinah. But I picked out this image just because if you zoom into the window there, seems to be some kind of turf war going on. The two cats there having some kind of argument, the black and white cat here being cool about it. I don't know what they're arguing about, but if you go on Street View, they kind of disappear as the Street View car moves along. So yes, turf war going on at the cat cafe. So the cat cafe is very popular. The cats are well cared for, by the way. They're all rescue cats. So it provides a home for rescue cats, homeless cats. They have a place where they can get away from the humans if they want to. So they only have to mix with humans if they want to. And there are cat carers who know every cat individually and know if someone's annoying it, if a human is annoying it. So they don't allow the cats to be distressed in any way. They don't even allow them to be annoyed, really. When the COVID pandemic hit, of course, everything went into lockdown and the cafe had to close. But what they did rather nicely was they decided to become, I don't know if this is the same worldwide, but in London, a lot of animal shelters had real problems finding homes for their animals, even finding foster homes for their animals. So the cat cafe opened themselves up as a foster home for cats. So animal shelters around London were bringing their cats to them, and they had their website acting as kind of an adoption agency for cats. And people could come to the window here and safely look at a cat, one of the cat carers, what about this one? And they could kind of meet in a more open space without any interaction. So it was a great idea. I'm sure a lot of cats found forever homes through their scheme. And they've remained as an adoption centre, actually. I did go on their website just while we were researching this, and it's still an adoption centre for cats, which is lovely. Good old cat cafe. Nearby is something which is not quite so lovely in East End history. There's quite a lot of East End history that's not so lovely, but this is Club Row in the circle there. Club Row, where unfortunately there was a live animal market, not meat market. This was pets, so this was songbirds and cats and dogs and working animals like dogs for watchdogs, cats for mouses, chickens, if a chicken counts as a working animal, racing pigeons. So it was an animal market that was, well, apparently started by the Huguenots. So the French Huguenots came over to London in the 1600s after they were persecuted in France. They came as refugees to London and settled in the East End. Many of them were weavers, and it was a kind of Huguenot tradition, if you were a weaver, to have a songbird, so that you didn't hear the repetitive sound of the weaving, you heard the sound of the songbird instead. And they brought that tradition with them to London, really quickly caught on in the East End, where many people were working at home. And there's a songbird shop in the East End in the early 19th century. And there were just cage birds everywhere. Contemporary authors like George Sims and Jack London and Charles Booth write of walking along streets where every window is filled with caged birds and they're all singing to each other. So the Huguenots kind of brought this, well, it's said that that's where the market was. I'm sure some of the stallholders did their best for their animals, but there was far too many cases of kind of neglect and cruelty. So quite rightly, Club Row Animal Market was shut down in the 1980s. And it was about that time when EastEnders started keeping fewer pets anyway. I mean, it hasn't been a pet census or anything, but when you walk around the East End, there's fewer cats staring at you from windows and fewer people walking their dogs. So it seems like people don't keep animals, pets very much in London. That's probably to do with the renting thing and the fact that people aren't as home as much. And so thank goodness for the cat cafe and all the many city farms we get to still hang out with animals. Right, sorry. I waffled.
Yeah. We're now moving into another area of the East End, the Isle of Dogs, which is the bit that's inside the big curve of the river that you can see in the title of EastEnders, for instance. The etymology of the name is disputed. It's named either because Henry VIII kept his hunting dogs there, or it might be a corruption of ducks. There is a local legend about the name that centuries ago, a man and his dog were walking here and he became disorientated and strayed into the marshes. The man drowned, but the dog refused to leave him and swam round and round his dead master. It's said that the area was named after this loyal dog, the Isle of Dogs. It's nothing to do with its etymology, but Thomas Nash wrote a play called The Isle of Dogs in 1597. It was considered so controversial that everyone involved in it, including Ben Jonson, were imprisoned, and all copies of the play were destroyed. On the Isle of Dogs is Mudchute City Farm. The name Mudchute comes from the fact that it was where all the spoil was dumped when the Millwall Dock was dug in the 18th century. A stadium for Millwall Football Club was also built on the site, and one of the footballers, Fred Pelly, said that if you fell over on the turf, it took days to wash out the smell of the mud. In the mid-20th century, clean water was finally pumped through the mud to get rid of the smell, and in the 1970s, the GLC decided that they wanted to build a tower block on it. The locals campaigned to keep their animals on allotments, and they won. In 1977, Mudchute Farm became official, and larger farm animals were brought in along with proper land and agricultural management. It's open to the public and provides great opportunities to take photos of the farm animals, including llamas, which are the traditional, but there you go, this is the modern world. with skyscrapers of Canary Wharf behind them, as you can see in the photograph there.
Yes, I have fond memories of Mudchute Farm. It was quite close to the place, well, one of the places we lived in the East End when I was a child. I remember going to see him, and it's actually, well, Canary Wharf wasn't quite built yet, so it was just the farm. I don't remember this great contrast as a child. Yeah, it's where we used to go on school trips, you know, they'd teach the inner city kids what mud looked like and where beef burgers came from and all that sort of thing, and how to ride a horse. Except the first time I rode a horse at Mudchute Farm, it threw me because it got freaked out by something. And I decided that I wasn't going to ride horses, I was going to walk, thank you. Or take the tube. Right, sorry, lost in my nostalgia. So, the other end of the Isle of Dogs from Mudchute Farm is now, anyway, Billingsgate Market. So just the bit of docks there at the top, there it is. Billingsgate Market moved to the Isle of Dogs in the early 1980s it used to be in the City of London and then it moved here. And Billingsgate Market there's one of the fish porters trying to flog his fish. The fish porters are kind of notorious for being tough, for being very no nonsense, for being rather, well, Billingsgate is almost slang for bad language. So they're tough porters, fish sellers, fishmongers at Billingsgate. And naturally, of course, these tough people don't go soppy over a grey seal that comes swimming into the docks. Oh, wait, yes, they do. That's Sammy the seal. Sammy the seal, so the dock right outside Billingsgate Market is a big dock with a chain link fence, big fence around it. And the Billingsgate porters, they have a code, sort of message, a signal for Sammy. So they go out to that and they kick the metal fence, kick the metal poles, and up pops Sammy. Sammy hears that underwater and she pops up, hello. And the fish porters feed her all their scraps. I was watching a documentary actually about Sammy, well, about various animals in London, and the fish porters were interviewed and they said, oh, well, yeah, she likes salmon and squid, and she doesn't like plaice. So she's got expensive taste, Sammy. The seal could get out anytime she wanted from that dock. There was an exit to the river. She could get out anytime she wanted, but why would you go anywhere when there's humans come and give you fish every day? And rescue you. In 2018, there was a big story that the fish porters knew her so well that they noticed that she was ill in 2018. She wasn't very well. So they took her out of the dock and got her to a vet. I'm afraid I don't know what happened to her after that. I hope she's okay. Even if she isn't, though, she'd been visiting Billingsgate, I think, for about 15 years or so. And seals only live about 25 years, I think. So anyway, whatever happened to Sammy, she seems to have told her friends. Because Canary Wharf, there's a grey seal, by the way. It's not a great picture of Sammy, so there's a grey seal posing. And that's Canary Wharf. If you want to go seal spotting, this is the place to do it in London. So Canary Wharf on the Isle of Dogs is kind of London's second financial district, and it's the place to go seal spotting these days. You can get there by DLR. I have to say the last time I went seal spotting, I didn't see a single seal, but I saw the cormorants. That made me happy. So, River Thames is home to seals, not just Sammy the seal. She's got lots of her friends now who all know about Billingsgate Fish Market. The Thames didn't always used to be that clean, though. It used to be used as a sewer. From the time of the Romans until the mid-1800s, it was London's sewer. It was an open sewer, so it was very stinky. They started using it as, they stopped using it rather as a sewer in the mid-1800s. Underground sewers were built. But 100 years after that, 1957, the Thames was declared biologically dead. It was thought that that's it, game over. There's nothing else, nothing in the river, nothing's going to live, ever. If you've watched any of our previous videos, you'll know that I'm rather a fan of cormorants. I do remember, I mean, it's been a long, slow recovery, but the cormorants were one of the first signals that it was really happening. So cormorants appeared and started to nest in the docks in the 1980s. That was very exciting because cormorants will only fish. I mean, seagulls will eat KFC quite happily. Cormorants won't. And I remember the excitement in my school anyway about the cormorants. More recently, in the last couple of years, lamprey eels have been found in the Thames. They might not be the most cuddly of creatures. They're very sensitive to pollution, though. So for them to appear in the Thames is very exciting news for the Thames's recovery. We'll talk about the bigger animals since we've started with Sammy the seal. So London Zoo has asked Londoners for several years to log the marine mammals that they see in the Thames. Because a lot of Londoners are as excited as me about seeing wildlife in the Thames, and they go out seal spotting. So far this year, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Have I written them down somewhere on our list? Oh yeah, there we go. So far this year, 149 harbour seals, 72 grey seals like Sammy, 17 seals which couldn't be identified, 23 harbour porpoises, and 8 dolphins have been seen in the Thames throughout the whole Thames. Not just the East End, whole Thames. So these gorgeous animals are returning to the Thames. We do get whales in the Thames, but it's not always a fairy tale ending, I'm afraid, for the whales that end up in the Thames, particularly if they get past the East End. Earlier this year, there was a minke whale, earlier in 2021, a baby minke whale got up to West London. That's not the whale, that's just a minke whale. The baby got up as far as the locks and sadly got trapped in the locks in West London. Londoners did try to help her to turn the whale around, but even a newborn minke whale is 9 foot long and weighs half a ton. So they just couldn't do anything. They couldn't save it. The poor thing died. A northern bottlenose whale suffered a similar fate, got out to West London, beached itself. You can see the Londoners trying to save the poor whale, but never could. But Benny the beluga has a happier story. Benny the beluga whale swam into the Thames in late 2018 and just kind of hung out in the Thames for a few months. He left of his own accord in 2019. Actually, I don't think anyone got close enough to find out whether it was a male or a female. Left of its own accord early in 2019 and seemed to be fine. It only got as far west as the East End. It didn't go into central London or West London. That seems to be the key. If a whale goes past the East End, it tends to get trapped or stuck or beached. So if anybody out there has an idea to stop whales going past the East End, I'm sure the London Wildlife Trust would be happy to hear it, as would all the whales that accidentally go. They don't mean to come into the Thames, whales. The seals and the dolphins do, the whales don't. It's just they get lost and disorientated. Right. We're on to another animal story, very dramatic animal story. Off to Tobacco Dock there, which is just off the Isle of Dogs. Oh, sorry, this is your story.
Charles, it concerns Charles Jamrack, who had an exotic pet shop on the Ratcliffe Highway. The Ratcliffe Highway was pretty notorious, but we're not going to that because it's like the old Cray twins. You don't need to know the dark side of its history. Anyway, it was a convenient place because of the docks being close by. It was good for importing animals and the main road for transporting the animals where he sold them. Jamrack named the shop Jamrack's Animal Emporium, and he dealt in all sorts of exotic creatures, as well as being open as a menagerie. A species of sea snail was actually named after Jamrack because he donated it to the zoologist at the British Museum for study. Bram Stoker even mentions Jamrack in Dracula in the book Jamrack Supplies a Wolf to London Zoo, which then escapes. In 1857, a dramatic incident took place at Jamrack's Animal Emporium on the Ratcliffe Highway. A Bengal tiger escaped from its crate and has picked up an 8-year-old boy who'd been watching the animals. Jamrack ran up to the tiger. With his bare hands, he forced them into the tiger's throat and forced it to let go of the child. Then he hit it on the head with a crowbar. The disorientated cat went back towards the stables and straight into another crate, which was shut on it. The boy survived with no more than a fright and a scratch, as Jamrack put it, although Jamrack still gave him £50 as compensation, which in today's money is about £3,000. The tiger ended up in a travelling menagerie, and there's a bronze statue commemorating the incident at Tobacco Dock.
Yes. Charles Jamrack was actually buried at Tower Hamlets Cemetery, which is up there. Tower Hamlets about Charlie Brown, not Snoopy, Charlie Brown. If you're an East Londoner of a certain age, you might remember Charlie Brown's pub, which was in Limehouse. It was filled with all sorts of exotic, some animals as well, from all over the world. It was popular with sailors. Sailors all over the world would say, meet you at Charlie Brown's. And then, well, the legend I was told was that the sailors would, if they had a bar tab that they couldn't pay off, they would bring Charlie Brown a gift from far away, like a stuffed animal or a statue or something, to pay off. So it was filled with all these wonderful things. I only remember looking through the window of Charlie Brown's because I was too young to go in. And then we moved away from London. By the time I got back, it had been knocked down. Anyway, sorry. Nostalgia, I said I wouldn't. So Tower Hamlets Cemetery, there it is. Tower Hamlets Cemetery is a cemetery, of course, but it's now been designated a local nature reserve. So people go in there to walk and listen to the birds. Sounds like a great place for bird spotting. They've got some volunteers who log all the birds and the creatures that they see, and bugs and butterflies and everything else as well. If you're a bird spotter, though, in Tower Hamlets Cemetery, they've seen recently red kite, as well as other birds of prey, kestrels and peregrines. Lots of species of owl, like the tawny owl here, swallows and swifts, and house martins have been seen in Tower Hamlets Cemetery, and woodpeckers, several species of woodpeckers. The black redstart has been seen in Tower Hamlets Cemetery, as well as mammals like the hedgehog and voles and foxes and things. So a great place for bird spotting if you're a keen bird spotter, and it's, you know, it's on the tube as well. One of the birds I want to talk a little bit more about here is the black redstart. There he is, that handsome chap in the corner there. The black redstart is a migratory bird, so it's always been seen in the UK, but just passing through. It decided to nest in the East End, so on the Isle of Dogs specifically. It stayed during the 1940s. So in the 1940s, the Isle of Dogs was particularly targeted during the Blitz because of the docks and the industry on the Isle of Dogs. Sadly, it was very heavily populated as well, so it must have been a terrifying time to be an East Ender. The surviving East Enders, though, with that East End spirit, found something good in those bomb sites. Great place for kids to play, but there were also plants would grow on the rubble, and this little bird came to nest there. So the black redstart, for some reason, found these bomb sites irresistible for building nests, and they all started nesting on the Isle of Dogs. They were nicknamed the bomb site bird. In fact, some old Londoners still call it that. I vaguely remember my grandparents referring to the bomb site bird. I didn't realise they meant this animal. So the bomb site bird, it was seen around the Isle of Dogs particularly. It's still seen in the East End. It's kind of River Lee. It's moved out to now that it's spotted a lot, and Tower Hamlets Cemetery. We are kind of hovering around the area of World War II, so we've got another World War II story.
During the time of World War II, there was a Mr. King who was volunteering as an ARP warden in ARP, technically, in Poplar. After a very heavy raid in 1940, he found a stray black terrier dog wandering around the rubble. Mr. King fed the dog a few scraps, and it followed him back to the ARP station, B132 on Southall Street. The dog decided it was staying and was adopted as a mascot for the ARP. He was given the name Rip, and here he is supervising some digging for victory in the picture. Rip began following the ARP wardens when they went out to respond to air raids, and the wardens quickly saw that Rip had a natural talent for finding people buried in the rubble. In his first year, he found over 100 people, and it's said that Rip's success inspired the government to begin training search and rescue dogs. Rip was only the second dog to be awarded the Dickinson Medal, which he wore on his collar until his death in 1946. Rip was buried at Ilford Animal Cemetery in Essex, and several other Dickinson Medal recipients were subsequently buried there, including a number of other dogs, a couple of pigeons, and Simon the cat, who served aboard HMS Amethyst. In 2007, Rip and his animal comrades were given proper gravestones and a full military memorial service, including a bugler playing the last post and a pigeon fly past.
That's lovely. What a lovely thing. The Dickin Medal is named after Maria Dickin, who set it up, who also, she's a very kind of East End figure. The Dickin Medal is considered kind of the Victoria Cross for animals. And it was awarded to, well, at first it was mostly pigeons, like this is Commando in the picture. The pigeons were, the first 4 pigeons to be awarded the Dickin Medal, the first 4 creatures to be awarded the Dickin Medal, were pigeons who were, during World War II, every RAF plane had a pigeon aboard as part of the crew, because if the plane crashed in the sea, then the pigeon could be released and could go and get help. They could tie a message to its leg, help, and off the pigeon would go. And then it would be able to return to its crewmates as well. Clever little birds, pigeons. I know we always mock them for being stupid, but they're actually got some cleverness to them. So the first 4 pigeons that were awarded, first 4 animals to be awarded the Dickin Medal were RAF pigeons. Where was it? Oh, Maria Dickin. Yes, that's right. So, yes, so Maria Dickin has a blue plaque. It was just outside the East End, really. So it's just north of it. Victoria Park is traditionally the northern boundary of the East End, and her blue plaque is just north of Victoria Park, but never mind. So Maria Dickin's plaque, okay. Maria Dickin lived in the East End in the 19th century. I think often people have this idea of the 19th century East End as being just wall-to-wall poverty and starvation. There were pockets of that, absolutely, in the 19th century East End, but quite a lot of the East End were working class people who weren't starving. I mean, they weren't rich, but they weren't starving, they were getting by. And some parts of the East End were also kind of middle class and kind of comfortably off. Maria Dickin's kind of in the middle class section of the East End. So she was, when she was in her 20s, I think it was, 20s or 30s, I'm not good at maths, her dog became ill. Her dog became ill and she was able to afford the vet bills to make the dog well. But she realised that other people in the East End, her more working class neighbours, her poorer neighbours, would not be able to afford the vet fees. We can see an East End couple here working by candlelight with their faithful cat at their feet there, looking out for a mouse. They would not be able to afford the vet bills. So, and she thought this was just dreadful. So she set up on the Whitechapel Road in 1917. So that puts her in her 40s, doesn't it? I'm so bad at maths. In 1917, however old she was, in 1917, she set up the first PDSA, that's People's Dispensary for Sick Animals. And it was free. So it was free treatment for any animal. She had a sign on the door that said, I forget the exact words, bring your sick animals, treatment is free, every animal treated. And the first day she opened, just the East End people were queuing up Whitechapel Road to come and have these volunteer animal experts, animal welfare people, look at their animals. So she did a really good thing. They got a sort of permanent vet clinic the following year. And in 1921, there she is with the first mobile vet clinic. Maria Dickin and the PDSA also set up a sort of rest home for working donkeys and ponies in Ilford, and set up the Ilford Animal Cemetery where Rip the dog and other Dickin medals, and she set up the Dickin medal as well in the 1940s. So Maria Dickin, definitely a friend to animals, and understood that people want to keep animals. Even when they don't have very much money, they want to keep animals and they want to make them well, as that crowd outside Whitechapel, the first PDSA in Whitechapel showed. Right, I've cheated slightly with Maria Dickin because she's technically outside the East End. So there's just one more famous person related to animals just outside the East End. Do you want to know?
On Mortimer Road in Hackney, there's a blue plaque for marine biologist Philip Henry Goss. Goss built the world's first public aquarium at London Zoo in 1853, and he invented the word aquarium, actually, which was from a portmanteau of aquatic vivarium. So there you go. His aquariums at London Zoo started a Victorian trend for home aquariums. So there we go. The old aquarium at the zoo has long been superseded by more modern habitats for the important conservation work which is being done there. The London Zoo is definitely not in the East End, but there is a huge aquarium which is just about in the East End. Right near the border with the City of London is the Heron Tower. And in the atrium of this office block, there is a huge aquarium, which when it was built, was Europe's largest private aquarium. It's still the largest in the UK. It holds 70,000 litres of water. It's 12 metres long and 4 metres high. The species in the aquarium are native to Heron Island, Australia. The aquarium requires 2 full-time fish attendants and 2 part-time divers to clean the glass and the rocks. Near the Heron Tower, there is a church called St. Helen's Bishopgate, which used to house a convent where the nuns were told off in the 14th century for dancing too much and keeping little dogs. Not strictly an animal story, and St. Helen's isn't strictly in the East End, but it's rather a nice thing to think of a lot of medieval nuns walking their little dogs after matins and having a great time dancing after Vespers.
It is a lovely thought. That nun's having a great time, look at her. So our last story is about the Tower of London. The Tower of London, which we did sort of sneak in to there's the Tower of London from the river. We snuck it into our episode about the City of London because it's just outside City of London limits, because there used to be a menagerie at the Tower of London from the 13th century to the 19th century. And we talked a little about the menagerie in the episode, which is on our YouTube channel, if you want to go and check out the City of London episode 2. What I want to talk about here is the ravens. So the ravens, there's one of the ravens at the tower. The ravens are said to have been at the tower for centuries. Spoilsport historians like to say, oh, well, they weren't directly mentioned until the 19th century. But I mean, ravens are native to the UK and they are clever birds. So I can imagine that they would have hung around the Tower of London. It was a palace for in its early days. So there would have been a lot of scraps coming out of the kitchen. When it was a menagerie, can you imagine the tasty scraps coming out of there if you're a crow? A raven, sorry. So ravens would have hung around the Tower of London. I feel that they would have done, and I feel they're probably not mentioned because they're native birds. It's nothing exotic. It's like mentioning there's a pigeon there. There's a legend about the ravens, and how old the legend is a little trickier to sort of prove that it's old. The legend is that if the ravens ever leave the Tower of London, the kingdom will fall and the tower walls will crumble. The legend was only recorded in the 19th century as well, but legends tend to be kind of oral quite a lot, don't they? So maybe it is older. The ravens are looked after by one of the yeoman warder, known as the Raven Master. And the Raven Master looks after the ravens, makes sure they're fed well with biscuits soaked in blood and eggs, and the current lot of ravens apparently are quite partial to Pringles. So Raven Master makes sure they're well looked after. They do occasionally clip the raven's wings. They actually don't at the moment, and they didn't about 40 years ago either. The ravens do leave the Tower of London. There was one of the ravens called Munin who went off for a little holiday in Greenwich, and she was spotted by somebody and returned to the tower. I want to be a bit delicate just in case the current Raven Master is watching this, because Malina, one of the ravens at the tower, recently did fly away from the Tower of London and hasn't returned. He seems pretty pessimistic about what's happened to Merlina, but I hope that he can have a little bit of optimism, because in the 1980s, a raven called Grog flew away from the Tower of London and was thought lost until, well, East End legend has it, that quite by accident, one of the yeoman warder went into a pub in Whitechapel on Redmond's Road called the Rose and Punch Bowl, which is sadly no longer there. Went into the pub and recognised Grog the Raven sitting on the bar. Hello. Grog had obviously decided that after, I think, 20 years he'd been at the tower, and Grog decided, right, I'm retiring, and I'm retiring to this pub. Thank you very much. So I hope that Merlina has found I hope nothing dreadful has happened to her, and that she's just found a nice little pub somewhere to retire to. And with the hope that Merlina's okay, even if she isn't, her legacy lives on. She did have a chick in 2020, George, who is still at the Tower of London. If you'd like to go and visit the Ravens, they're often running around the tower and nicking people's Pringles. And that's it. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a great time with these tours. We love sort of researching them and looking through our notes and going, oh yeah, do you remember that? Normally in a real life tour, we would make a crass tip speech, and our tip jar, our virtual tip jar, is down there. But we would also very much like it if you could donate to Battersea Dogs and Cats Home at justgiving.com/fundraising/virtually London Battersea, or indeed at their website, or support any of the East End City Farms would be great as well, that we've spoken about today, and Stepney City Farm, which I didn't mention, also cool. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you for the next episode.